A lot of people have been making videos on the channel The Rewired Soul lately. And in this video, I'm going to discuss something that I haven't seen brought up in many other videos on YouTube. And that is, The Rewired Soul has a channel which he calls a mental health advocacy channel. And he says that part of the purpose of his channel is to reduce the stigma surrounding mental illness. But I think the kind of videos he makes actually increases the stigma around mental illness. Also, the Rewired Soul has actually referred to himself as a mental health professional. In reality, he's not a licensed mental health professional, and if he was an actual mental health professional, most of the leading mental health professional organizations, like the American Psychiatric Association, would regard what he is doing with his YouTube channel as being unethical. And in part, it would be considered unethical because the way he comments about the mental health of others is considered something that encourages stigma around mental illness. In most of the videos on the Rewired Soul's channel, he will talk about someone who is well-known, often well-known on the internet, and speculate about their mental health. For example, he made several videos about Trisha Paytas, in which he technically didn't diagnose her, but he did say that she has all the signs and symptoms of borderline personality disorder, and claimed that a lot of her behavior is the behavior of what people with borderline personality disorder do. And the thing about psychiatric illnesses is none of them have an objective biological test. So whenever you make a psychiatric diagnosis, you pretty much just have to base it on the symptoms. So saying someone has the signs and symptoms of borderline personality disorder comes very close to basically diagnosing them with borderline personality disorder. Also, for at least one YouTuber who goes by Leafy Greens, he did say that he thinks that she has borderline personality disorder, which means that he did, in a way, diagnose her. Now, this is the kind of thing that the American Psychiatric Association would consider unethical for its members to do. According to Section .3 of the Principles of Medical Ethics made by the American Psychiatric Association, on occasion, psychiatrists are asked for an opinion about an individual who is in the light of public attention or who has disclosed information about himself, herself through public media. In such circumstances, a psychiatrist may share with the public his or her expertise about psychiatric issues in general. However, it is unethical for a psychiatrist to offer a professional opinion unless he or she has conducted an examination and has been granted proper authorization for such a statement. This rule is called the Goldwater Rule. It is called the Goldwater Rule because in the 1964 presidential election, when Barry Goldwater was running for president, a magazine called Facts Magazine, which was only around for a few years in the 60s, published an article in which several psychiatrists claimed that Barry Goldwater was unfit to be president psychologically. Barry Goldwater ended up suing the magazine and winning. And this whole incident got a big backlash about whether psychiatrists should make diagnoses of people who are public figures that they have not professionally examined and that they did not have permission to discuss in the media. So that's why the American Psychiatric Association created the Goldwater Rule, and the American Psychological Association pretty much said that they agree with the Goldwater Rule and that their members also should refrain from doing these things for public figures or people in the media whom they have not examined and who they do not have permission to discuss in the media. Now, in 2017, the American Psychiatric Association, in a way, sort of expanded the Goldwater Rule, saying that the Goldwater Rule shouldn't simply apply to a diagnosis, but it should apply to any sort of comments about a person's mental health. In other words, simply commenting on someone's mental health who is in the media is considered unethical for a psychiatrist to do. So it's unethical to do something like Chris's video on Trisha Paytas, in which he is commenting on her mental health, even if he claims to stop short of actually diagnosing her. Now, of course, Chris is not a real mental health professional, but he does sort of present himself as a kind of quasi-therapist. And there are several reasons for the Goldwater rule, one of them being that when you start commenting on the mental health of people in the media, that can actually encourage the stigma of mental illness. As the American Psychiatric Association says on their website, when psychiatrists offer medical opinions about an individual they have never examined, this behavior has the potential to stigmatize those with mental illness. Patients who see a psychiatrist, especially their own psychiatrist, offering opinions about individuals whom the psychiatrist has not examined may lose confidence in their psychiatrist and or the profession and may additionally experience stigma related to their own diagnosis. Specifically, patients may wonder about the rigor and integrity of their own clinical care and diagnosis and confidentiality of their own psychiatric treatment. Now, keep in mind that the American Psychiatric Association did say that this is not just limited to making a diagnosis. They actually say that it's unethical to make any sort of comments about someone's mental health that they have not examined professionally and that they do not have their permission to, or at least authorization from something like the government to do so. Now look, I do understand that Chris is not a real mental health professional, and I don't think that people who are not mental health professionals should be held to this standard. If someone who is not a mental health professional wants to speculate on someone's mental health, even if they haven't examined them, well, it's not really the same thing. But as the YouTuber Bipolar Corner has pointed out, Chris has actually claimed to be a mental health professional, even though he is not a licensed one.
So yeah, I am a mental health professional. I work in mental health, I work in treatment, all of that, but I'm not a licensed therapist or anything.
And that's the trouble with Chris from the Rewired Soul. Like the channel Prim Inc. said, Chris sort of acts like YouTube's pretend therapist. And I have no problem with a non-mental health professional talking about mental health. Just because someone is not a mental health professional doesn't mean that they can't talk about mental health, and in some cases, a non-professional, especially if their videos are well-researched, might actually be more accurate than an actual professional. The problem with the Rewired Soul is he comes across as this person who claims he's a mental health professional, although he's not licensed, and he sort of acts like a quasi-therapist. And even though he isn't held to the same standards because he's not a mental health professional, I think that what he does unfortunately end up contributing to the stigma behind mental illness. Now, one real mental health professional whose channel I do like is Dr. Todd Grande, and he did criticize the Rewired Soul on his channel as well.
And what he's really doing here is kind of looking at these people and their behavior and connecting that to mental health topics. And this is one of my criticisms. This is where it gets a little tricky. He says that those people are public figures, right? They're putting their information out on YouTube, and that means it's vulnerable. It's available to target for videos. And I think part of that's correct and part of that's not correct. Individuals who are famous or quasi-famous or somewhat known to some people still have rights, and pointing out potential mental health symptoms for these people or anybody is really not okay. But there is here a difference between something quantifiable and concrete and something where you're making an inference, right? So for example, if some celebrity has 3 DUIs and Chris were to make a video and say that this behavior is dangerous, well, that's quantifiable and concrete. They were convicted 3 times of drinking and driving or driving under the influence. If somebody is found passed out in an alley somewhere, just unconscious in an alley, and a video is made kind of inferring they're using substances, that's a little different because we really don't know that, right? So there's a little bit of a distinction there, and I see this as a bit of a gray area. It's something that I certainly stay away from on my channel, but I can understand how this is still partially legitimate. There are certain things that we could see in people who are public figures, and we could criticize them, and there's other things that we wouldn't want to criticize. I stay away from all mental health topics with public figures or with anybody. Now, Chris isn't a mental health clinician. He makes that pretty clear in his videos. I don't think he really misrepresents that in any way that I could see. So maybe he gets more leeway because it's entertainment. I don't know. But either way, it's a criticism of mine. It doesn't feel like a legitimate way to produce educational content. So do these quasi-celebrities put their information out there? And is it public? sure, but one can still go too far.
And that's the thing about the Rewired Soul is, yes, while it is true that since Chris is not a true mental health professional, and I don't think that Dr. Grande is aware that Chris has actually called himself a mental health professional, but the fact that he's not does mean that he gets a little bit more leeway, but it is possible to go too far. And I think that the Rewired Soul often does go too far. In fact, I think that most of the videos that he makes in which he is criticizing and commenting on the mental health of YouTubers and people like that go too far. And he has a tendency to sort of be very judgmental. And that's the kind of thing that actually can contribute to the stigma of mental illness. And that's the irony, is that the Rewired Soul says that his channel is about fighting stigma, but it's not. In reality, his videos often increase stigma. And look, I think that the Rewired Soul seems like a nice person. I don't really know him that well, but my impressions of him is that he is a nice fellow and that maybe he doesn't mean harm, or maybe he does. I don't really know, but I think that either way, I think that a lot of his videos are misguided. I think that he is, in fact, stigmatizing mental health, and if you really want a truly educational channel on mental health, I don't recommend the Rewired Soul for that reason. I'm going to include a clip from Dr. Jenny Byrne on the Goldwater rule and how it does contribute to the stigma of mental illness when mental health professionals comment on the mental health of a public figure. Now, in this video, she is primarily talking about politicians, but I do want to point out that the Goldwater rule does not only apply to politicians, it actually applies to anybody who a mental health professional has not examined and does not have authorization to discuss the mental health of.
And then the third one, which I think in some ways is the most interesting ethical part, is that by saying things about a candidate, especially a negative or something meant to kind of discredit them, we are in fact kind of promoting the idea that people with psychiatric problems should be discriminated against, right? So for example, if someone has had a history of major depressive disorder, and then a psychiatrist would say they're unfit to run for office because, well, who knows, they may have a psychiatric problem, they may get depressed while they're in office. That's very discriminatory. Major depressive disorder, like other medical illnesses, is something that is treatable. It's something that with proper treatment you can stay in remission often for very long periods of time. And even if you were to have a major depressive episode while you were president, there are things that you can do. And actually there's some evidence that some of our most famous presidents, including Abraham Lincoln, maybe did have depression. So by us saying something about the psychiatric condition of a candidate or the president or any other political figure, we are discrediting them, and that discrediting is a form of discrimination.
So, since Chris is not a real mental health professional, it is true that he is not held to the same standards. But since he does try to come across as a quasi-therapist, I do think that a lot of the videos he makes are actually encouraging stigma of mental illness. And since he claims that his channel is all about fighting the stigma of mental illness, I think that he should refrain from making the kinds of videos that he makes where he comments on the mental health of people on YouTube or, other people who, it's just not really okay to do what he does. I mean, yeah, he's not an actual licensed professional, but I think that if he really cares about avoiding stigma, he would stop making the kinds of videos that he has been making. So if you like this video and you'd like to see more videos on mental health and other fascinating topics, subscribe to my channel, click the bell icon for notifications, and together we shall take over the world. You can also catch me on Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, and Twitch at Zorkmid123.